In the end, Adam Richardson had learned that loyalty without truth is just another form of betrayal, and that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing. The 30 years between Marcus's disappearance and Thomas Peterson's conviction had been marked by pain and uncertainty, but they had also demonstrated the power of persistence, the importance of hope, and the eventual triumph of truth over even the most carefully constructed lies. The coffee mug could be replaced, the broken trust could be rebuilt. The secrets that had poisoned a community for 30 years had finally been exposed to the disinfecting light of truth. And somewhere in a prison cell, Thomas Peterson had faced the consequences of choices made in desperation 30 years earlier, proving that time may heal some wounds, but it never erases the debt that justice demands. Marcus Webb's story was finally complete, not with the happy ending that everyone had hoped for, but with the truth that everyone deserved. And sometimes, Adam had learned, truth is the only gift we can give to the dead. The promise that their stories will not be forgotten, their lives will not be dismissed, and their killers will not escape the reckoning that justice eventually delivers to all who believe they can murder with impunity. The rain washed the last fragments of ceramic down the storm drain, carrying away the physical remnants of the moment when the past had finally caught up with the present. But the memory of Marcus Webb, and the lessons learned from his tragic disappearance, would endure long after the storm had passed and the streets had dried. Some stories, Adam knew now, are too important to remain untold, regardless of how much pain the telling might cause. "Hey Richardson, you doing anything after school?" The question caught Adam off guard. Marcus hadn't initiated a conversation between them in months, hadn't sought out his company since early in the school year when the social hierarchies had solidified into their current configuration. Adam's heart jumped with the pathetic hope that maybe, just maybe, his old friend was ready to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Not really. Why? Marcus glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. When he spoke, his voice carried an urgency that Adam had never heard before. "I need a favor, man. A big one. Can you meet me at the old quarry after school, like maybe 4:30? The old quarry sat 2 miles outside town, an abandoned limestone operation that had filled with groundwater decades earlier to create a swimming hole that generations of Riverside teenagers had used for parties and romantic encounters. It was isolated, hidden from the main roads by dense woods that made it perfect for activities that adults preferred not to know about. "What kind of favor?" Adam asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Marcus's urgency felt wrong, desperate in a way that set off alarm bells in Adam's naturally cautious mind. "I can't explain here. Just trust me, okay? I really need your help with something, please." The please was what did it. Marcus Webb had never said please to anyone in Adam's memory, had never needed to. His natural charisma and social position meant that requests were usually treated as commands, favors granted eagerly by those seeking his approval. Hearing that word from Marcus's lips suggested desperation that touched something deep in Adam's memory of their childhood friendship. "Okay," Adam heard himself saying, 4:30 at the quarry. Marcus's relief was visible, his shoulders sagging as if some enormous weight had been momentarily lifted. "Thanks, man. I owe you one. A big one." Then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of students heading for the parking lot and weekend freedom. Adam finished organizing his locker, gathered his weekend homework, and walked to his beat-up Honda Civic with a growing sense that he'd just agreed to something that would change everything. He had no idea how right he was. The drive to the quarry took Adam through the heart of rural Illinois, past cornfields that stretched to the horizon and farmhouses that had weathered decades of prairie storms. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, and spring wildflowers dotted the roadside with splashes of color that should have lifted his spirits. Instead, he felt increasingly anxious as he turned onto the gravel road that led to the quarry, Marcus's unusual behavior playing over and over in his mind. The quarry parking area was empty when Adam arrived at 4:25 p.m. He pulled his Honda next to the rusted guardrail that was supposed to keep vehicles from driving too close to the water's edge, turned off the engine and waited. The silence was profound, broken only by bird calls and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. The quarry itself stretched out before him like a dark mirror, its still surface reflecting the cloudy sky and the limestone cliffs that rose from its edges. Marcus's Camaro roared into the parking area at exactly 4:30, gravel spraying from its tires as he pulled up beside Adam's Honda. The engine's rumble echoed off the quarry walls before dying into silence. Marcus climbed out of the driver's seat, and Adam immediately noticed that something was wrong. His friend's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous energy that manifested in rapid, jerky movements and eyes that couldn't seem to focus on any one thing for more than a few seconds. "Thanks for coming," Marcus said, his voice higher than usual. "I wasn't sure you would." "What's this about, Marcus? You're acting really weird. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Adam remembered from childhood when his friend was struggling with difficult decisions. I'm in trouble, man. Deep trouble, and I need someone I can trust to help me figure this out. The word trust hit Adam with unexpected force. When was the last time Marcus had trusted him with anything more significant than homework answers? When was the last time Marcus had needed anything from him at all? Despite his growing unease, Adam felt a familiar warmth at being needed by the friend who had once meant everything to him. What kind of trouble? Marcus walked to the edge of the quarry, staring down at the dark water as if it might hold answers to questions he couldn't articulate. Remember Jenny Morris? Adam nodded. Jenny was a sophomore, 15 years old, pretty in the wholesome way that made older boys notice and parents worry. She'd been dating Marcus on and off since January, much to the disapproval of her parents who thought 17 was too old for their daughter to be seeing. What about Jenny? Marcus's hands were shaking now, and when he turned to face Adam, his eyes held a desperation that was almost frightening. She's pregnant, Adam. 3 months pregnant, and she's threatening to tell everyone that I'm the father. The words hit Adam like a physical blow. In 1993 rural Illinois, teenage pregnancy was still scandalous enough to destroy reputations and derail futures. For someone like Marcus, whose college football scholarships and family expectations depended on maintaining his golden boy image, such a revelation would be catastrophic. Are you the father, I mean? I don't know, Marcus exploded, his voice echoing across the water. Maybe, probably. Does it matter? If she tells people I'm screwed, no scholarship, no college, my dad will kill me. Everything I've worked for gone. Adam struggled to process this revelation, trying to reconcile the Marcus he'd known with someone who could be so careless, so thoughtless about consequences. What do you want me to do about it? I need you to talk to her. Tonight. She respects you, thinks you're smart and honest and all that. If you explain to her how this would ruin my life, maybe she'd listen. Maybe she'd keep quiet until we can figure something else out. The request made Adam's stomach turn. The idea of pressuring a pregnant 15-year-old girl to keep quiet about her situation for the benefit of the boy who had gotten her into trouble felt fundamentally wrong. It violated every principle his parents had taught him about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. I can't do that, Marcus. She's scared and confused, and she needs support, not pressure to keep secrets. Marcus's expression darkened, revealing something Adam had never seen before, a coldness that transformed his friend's familiar features into something alien and threatening. She's going to destroy everything, Adam. Everything I've worked for. Everything my family expects. You don't understand what this means. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you got her pregnant. The words came out harsher than Adam intended, but he couldn't take them back. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, and Adam could see his mind working, calculating, considering options that Adam couldn't begin to imagine. Fine, Marcus said finally. If you won't help me, I'll handle it myself. Something in his tone made Adam's blood run cold. Handle it however I need to. Marcus turned away from the quarry and walked back toward his Camaro, his movements sharp and decisive in a way that suggested he'd made some terrible decision. Adam watched him go, torn between loyalty to a childhood friend and growing certainty that Marcus was planning something that would make their current problem seem insignificant by comparison. Marcus, wait. Don't do anything stupid. His friend paused with his hand on the Camaro's door handle, looking back over his shoulder with an expression Adam would never forget, equal parts desperation, determination, and something that might have been madness. Sometimes stupid is all you have left. The Camaro's engine roared to life, and Marcus spun out of the parking area in a shower of gravel and dust. Adam stood alone beside the quarry, watching the taillights disappear into the gathering dusk, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd just witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had no idea that it was the last time anyone would see Marcus Webb alive. Adam Richardson spent that Friday evening in his bedroom, supposedly working on weekend homework, but actually staring at the pages without comprehending a single word. Marcus's desperate confession played over and over in his mind, along with growing dread about what his friend might do in his current state of panic. By midnight, Adam had made a decision that would torment him for 30 years. He would wait and see what happened before involving any adults in Marcus's crisis. It was a decision born of 18 years of conditioning about loyalty and friendship, about protecting those you cared about even when they made terrible mistakes. Adam told himself that Marcus would cool down overnight, would realize that running away or doing something drastic would only make things worse. He told himself that Saturday morning would bring clarity and that his friend would make the right choice when faced with the actual consequences of his actions. Adam was wrong on all counts. Saturday morning brought Detective Frank Mueller to the Webb household at 8:30 a.m., responding to a frantic call from Marcus's father, who had discovered that his son had never come home Friday night. The Camaro was missing, Marcus's bedroom looked like it hadn't been slept in, and his wallet and driver's license were gone, suggesting either flight or foul play. Mueller, a 30-year veteran of rural law enforcement, began what would become the most frustrating case of his career. The initial investigation focused on the assumption that Marcus had run away, possibly to escape some unknown pressure or problem. His friends were questioned routinely, including Adam, who found himself sitting in Detective Mueller's office on Sunday afternoon, lying with increasing fluency as the questions became more specific. Did Marcus seem upset about anything? Any problems with school, family, girlfriend? Adam could have mentioned Jenny Morrison's pregnancy, could have described Marcus's desperation at the quarry, could have provided the crucial context that might have prevented weeks of futile search. Instead, he shook his head and offered vague responses about teenage stress and college pressure. He seemed normal to me, maybe a little worried about final exams, but nothing unusual. The lie came easily, justified by loyalty and the lingering hope that Marcus might still turn up safe. Adam convinced himself that revealing Marcus's secret would only cause more pain for everyone involved, especially Jenny Morrison, who deserved to have her privacy protected regardless of Marcus's fate. As days passed without any sign of Marcus, the investigation expanded beyond the assumption of voluntary departure. Detective Mueller organized search parties that combed through the woods around Riverside, checked abandoned buildings and remote locations where a teenage boy might hide or where someone might dispose of evidence. They found nothing. Jenny Morrison was questioned as part of the routine canvass of Marcus's recent contacts, but without knowing about her pregnancy, investigators treated her as just another teenage girlfriend who might have insight into his state of mind. Jenny, dealing with her own crisis and terror about her condition becoming public knowledge, provided no useful information about Marcus's disappearance. She seemed genuinely shocked and confused by the news, leading investigators to rule her out as a suspect or significant witness. The search for Marcus Webb consumed Riverside's small police department for 6 weeks before being officially classified as a missing person case, rather than an active investigation. Detective Mueller had exhausted every lead, interviewed every potential witness, and searched every location that might conceivably hide evidence. Marcus had simply vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only questions and a family destroyed by uncertainty. Adam Richardson graduated from Riverside High School 3 weeks after Marcus's disappearance, walking across the stage to receive his diploma while an empty chair in the audience marked where his friend should have been sitting. The ceremony was subdued, overshadowed by the reality that one of their classmates was missing and possibly dead. Adam's valedictorian speech, which he'd planned to dedicate to friendship and shared memories, instead focused on moving forward and not letting tragedy define their future. The summer of 1993 passed in a haze of guilt and rationalization for Adam, who convinced himself daily that his silence was protecting everyone involved. Marcus was gone, probably dead, and revealing his secret would only cause additional pain for his family and for Jenny Morrison, who had quietly left town in June to stay with relatives in another state. Adam's lie had become a fact through repetition, and the longer he maintained it, the harder it became to imagine telling the truth. College at Northwestern University provided escape from the constant reminders of Marcus's disappearance, but it couldn't silence Adam's conscience. He threw himself into his engineering studies with the desperate focus of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts, graduating summa cum laude and immediately beginning graduate school to delay his return to the real world, where his lies waited like landmines. The years passed, and Adam built what appeared to be a successful life. He earned his PhD in mechanical engineering, landed a job with a Chicago firm specializing in infrastructure development, married a colleague named Patricia, who knew nothing about his past, and gradually convinced himself that his teenage lies were ancient history that would never matter again. But secrets, Adam discovered, were like radioactive material. Their half-life was longer than anyone expected, and their effects could surface decades after you thought they were safely buried. The first sign that the past was catching up came in October 2018, 25 years after Marcus's disappearance, when Adam received a Facebook message from Detective Sarah Chen of the Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit. The message was brief and professional, explaining that Marcus Webb's case was being reviewed as part of a statewide initiative to apply modern investigative techniques to unsolved disappearances. Adam's hands shook as he read the message, all the carefully buried anxiety of 25 years flooding back in an instant. Detective Chen was requesting interviews with Marcus's former classmates and friends, hoping that fresh perspectives might reveal details that had been overlooked in the original investigation. She would like to speak with Adam at his earliest convenience. The interview took place at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, neutral territory where Adam hoped he could maintain his composure while repeating the same lies he'd told Detective Mueller in 19. Chen was younger than he'd expected, probably in her 30s, with the sharp intelligence of someone who'd built her career on seeing patterns that others missed. I know this was a long time ago, Mr. Richardson, but sometimes people remember details differently as they get older. Sometimes things that seemed unimportant at 18 seem significant at 43. Adam sipped his coffee and tried to project the calm confidence of a successful professional discussing ancient history. I've thought about Marcus a lot over the years. We were good friends in elementary school, though we'd grown apart by senior year. I honestly can't think of anything I didn't tell Detective Mueller back then. Chen nodded, making notes in a small notebook that seemed somehow more threatening than the recording devices used by television detectives. What about his relationship with Jenny Morrison? Did he ever mention any problems there? The question hit Adam like an electric shock, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. They dated off and on, typical teenage stuff. Nothing that seemed serious enough to make him disappear. Did you know that Jenny was pregnant when Marcus disappeared? Adam's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as he set it down, the sound echoing through the small cafe like a gunshot. 25 years of carefully constructed lies began crumbling in an instant, as he stared at Detective Chen's knowing expression. No, I didn't know that. Really? Because Jenny Morrison told us that Marcus knew about the pregnancy. She said he was extremely upset about it, even mentioned that he'd talked to a friend about possible solutions. She couldn't remember which friend, but she was certain he'd discussed it with someone. The walls of the coffee shop seemed to be closing in on Adam as he struggled to maintain his composure. How had Jenny Morrison remembered details after 25 years that she'd apparently forgotten in 19? How much did Detective Chen actually know, and how much was educated guessing designed to make him reveal information? If Marcus knew about that, he never mentioned it to me, Adam managed to say. Like I said, we weren't as close during senior year. Chen studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. That's interesting, because we have cell phone records showing that Marcus called your house on the afternoon he disappeared. The call lasted 17 minutes. Can you think of any reason he might have needed to talk to you for that long on the day he vanished? The lie collapsed completely. Adam felt 25 years of careful deception exploding like a controlled demolition, leaving him sitting in the ruins of his constructed reality. Detective Chen was watching him with the patient intensity of a cat waiting for a mouse to make its fatal mistake. Mr. Richardson, I think there are things about Marcus Webb's disappearance that you haven't told anyone, things that might be crucial to understanding what happened to him. This is your chance to set the record straight. Adam Richardson sat in that Chicago coffee shop on a gray October morning in 2018, and made the decision that had been 25 years in the making. He was going to tell the truth, regardless of the consequence. The weight he'd carried since high school was finally too heavy to bear, and Detective Chen's patient, knowing gaze made it clear that his secret was already partially exposed. You're right, he said quietly. There are things I never told anyone, things I should have said 25 years ago. What followed was a confession that lasted 3 hours and filled 17 pages of Detective Chen's notebook. Adam described the meeting at the quarry, Marcus's desperation about Jenny's pregnancy, his cryptic threat to handle it himself, and the terrible decision to remain silent about the entire encounter. With each detail, Adam felt both relief and increasing dread about what his revelation might mean for everyone involved. Chen listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly letting Adam's story pour out like water through a broken dam. When he finished, she closed her notebook and looked at him with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and professional. Mr. Richardson, what you've told me changes everything about this case. We're going to need you to provide a formal statement, and depending on what we find, you may need to testify if this goes to trial. Trial? You think Marcus was murdered? I think Marcus Webb made some very poor decisions, and got involved with people who were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. Your information gives us a motive and a timeline that we never had before. More importantly, it gives us a reason to look at suspects we dismissed 25 years ago. The investigation that followed Adam's confession moved with the efficiency of modern law enforcement, combined with the persistence of detectives who had devoted their careers to solving cold cases. Detective Chen's team re-interviewed Jenny Morrison, now a 40-year-old mother of 3 living in Wisconsin under her married name of Jennifer Walsh. Jennifer's memory of spring 1993 had been shaped by trauma and time, but Adam's revelation unlocked details that she'd suppressed for decades. Yes, she confirmed, Marcus had known about her pregnancy. Yes, he'd been desperate to keep it secret. And yes, he'd mentioned having a plan to make the problem disappear permanently. He scared me, Jennifer told Detective Chen during their interview in Milwaukee. The way he talked about the pregnancy, about me, like I was some kind of problem that needed to be solved rather than a person who needed help. I was 15 and terrified, and he was more worried about his scholarship than about what I was going through. More significantly, Jennifer remembered details about Marcus's behavior in the days before his disappearance that investigators had never known to ask about in 19. He'd been asking questions about her family's routines, about when her parents would be away from home, about whether she'd told anyone else about the pregnancy. The questions had seemed like concern at the time, but in retrospect they felt like reconnaissance for something darker. The breakthrough came when Detective Chen's team decided to re-examine physical evidence from 1993, using forensic techniques that hadn't existed when Marcus first disappeared. The Camaro had been found 6 months after Marcus vanished, abandoned in a shopping center parking lot in Springfield, Illinois, 150 miles from Riverside. The car had been processed for fingerprints and other evidence, but DNA analysis wasn't standard procedure for missing person cases in 19. Stored in the Illinois State Police Evidence Facility were samples taken from the Camaro's interior, hair fibers, skin cells, traces of blood that had been too small to analyze with 1990s technology. Modern DNA extraction techniques could now produce genetic profiles from microscopic samples, opening possibilities that investigators had never imagined. The analysis revealed Marcus's DNA throughout the vehicle, which was expected, but it also revealed genetic material from 2 other individuals. One profile matched Jennifer Morrison's DNA, which investigators had obtained during their recent interview. The second profile belonged to someone whose identity would shock everyone involved in the case. Detective Chen called Adam Richardson at his Chicago office on a Thursday morning in November 2018. "Mr. Richardson, we need to meet. We've identified the second DNA profile from Marcus's car, and it's someone you know." They met at the same coffee shop where Adam had first confessed his secret, but this time the atmosphere was charged with the electricity of a case approaching resolution. Chen spread photographs across the small table, Marcus's senior portrait, the Camaro crime scene photos, and a more recent image that made Adam's coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. The photograph showed Thomas Peterson, their former American history teacher, at a recent school board meeting. Peterson was now 68 years old, retired, living quietly in Riverside, where he'd taught for 43 years before stepping down in 2015. His DNA had been in the system because of a DUI arrest 2 years earlier, part of Illinois' expanded database collection policy. "Thomas Peterson," Chen said quietly, "your teacher, the man whose class you and Marcus attended on the afternoon he disappeared. We found his DNA on the steering wheel and door handle of Marcus's car, and we found Marcus's blood on a jacket that Peterson threw away in 1993 but that his wife kept in storage." Adam stared at Peterson's photograph, trying to reconcile the mild-mannered teacher he remembered with the implications of Chen's revelation. Peterson had taught American history at Riverside High for decades, a fixture in the school and community, respected by students and colleagues alike. The idea that he could have been involved in Marcus's disappearance seemed impossible. "I don't understand. Why would Mr. Peterson want to hurt Marcus?" Chen opened her notebook to pages filled with details that painted a picture darker than anything Adam had imagined. "We've been investigating Peterson's background, and we found some disturbing patterns. Financial records show that he was heavily in debt in 1993, gambling debts specifically. He owed money to people who don't accept late payments or negotiated settlement." The detective continued building her case with methodical precision. "We also found evidence that Peterson had been selling drugs to students, using his position to identify kids from wealthy families who could afford to pay premium prices for marijuana and prescription pills. Marcus Webb was one of his customers." Adam felt the room spinning as the implications became clear. Marcus hadn't just been a random victim, he'd been involved with Peterson in ways that created motives for violence, beyond anything the original investigation had considered. The pregnancy crisis had been just one element in a much more complex and dangerous situation. Marcus owed Peterson money for drugs, and Peterson owed money to his gambling creditors. When Marcus disappeared, both problems were solved. The debt died with Marcus, and Peterson had access to Marcus's car and personal belongings, which he could sell to raise quick cash. Chen showed Adam additional evidence. Financial records indicating that Peterson had made several large cash deposits in the weeks following Marcus's disappearance. Phone records placing Peterson near the quarry on the afternoon Marcus vanished, and witness statements from other students who remembered Peterson asking unusual questions about Marcus's whereabouts and activities. "We think Peterson lured Marcus to a meeting on the pretext of discussing his debt or possibly offering some kind of solution to the pregnancy situation. Instead, he killed Marcus and disposed of his body somewhere that we haven't found yet." The abandoned car in Springfield was meant to suggest that Marcus had run away, but Peterson didn't realize that DNA technology would eventually expose his involvement. The arrest of Thomas Peterson took place on December 3, 2018, at his modest retirement home in Riverside, the same house where he'd lived for 30 years while teaching generations of students, including the boy he'd murdered in 1993. Peterson offered no resistance when police arrived with warrants, but his expression suggested that he'd been expecting this moment for 25 years. The confession came during Peterson's third interrogation session, delivered with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to teaching Civil War battles to disinterested teenagers. Yes, he'd killed Marcus Webb. Yes, he'd disposed of the body in a location that searchers had never found. And yes, he'd lived with the secret for 25 years while continuing to teach, continuing to influence young lives, continuing to present himself as a pillar of the community. The motive was exactly what Detective Chen had theorized. Peterson's gambling addiction had created debts that threatened his career and possibly his life. Marcus had become involved in Peterson's drug-dealing operation, partly to fund his own lifestyle and partly because Peterson had gradually manipulated him into deeper involvement through a combination of academic favoritism and financial incentive. When Marcus learned about Jenny's pregnancy and realized that exposure would destroy his future, he'd confronted Peterson about accelerating their drug operation to raise money quickly. Marcus wanted enough cash to pay for Jenny to take care of the problem, as he'd put it, and to buy her silence about their relationship. Peterson had agreed to meet him at the quarry to discuss the plan. Instead, Peterson had come prepared for murder. He'd brought a tire iron from his garage and had struck Marcus in the head during their argument about the drug operation. Marcus's death hadn't been premeditated, but Peterson's disposal of the body and elaborate cover-up certainly were. He'd loaded Marcus into the Camaro's trunk, driven to a remote location, buried the body, and then abandoned the car in Springfield to suggest that Marcus had run away. The location of Marcus's grave remained Peterson's final secret. Despite extensive searches based on his vague descriptions and analysis of his movements in 1993, investigators never found Marcus's remains. Peterson claimed his memory was unclear about the exact burial site, but Adam suspected that keeping that final secret was the old teacher's way of maintaining some control over a situation that had completely escaped his authority. Thomas Peterson was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole on charges of first-degree murder, drug trafficking and tampering with evidence. At 70 years old, the sentence was effectively a death penalty administered through natural causes rather than execution. He died of a heart attack in his cell 18 months later, taking the location of Marcus Webb's body to his grave. Adam Richardson testified at Peterson's trial, his 30-year secret finally exposed to the community that had wondered about Marcus Webb's fate for decades. The revelation that their respected teacher had been both a drug dealer and a murderer shocked Riverside more than Marcus's disappearance ever had. It forced residents to question their assumptions about trust, authority, and the people they allowed to influence their children's lives. The psychological impact on Adam was profound but ultimately liberating. 30 years of carried guilt evaporated during his testimony, replaced by the complex satisfaction of finally telling the truth about events that had shaped his entire adult life. He underwent therapy to deal with the trauma of his teenage experience and the decades of suppressed guilt, eventually finding peace with his role in the tragedy. Jennifer Morrison Walsh also testified, her own 30-year secret revealed in the process. The pregnancy that had caused so much fear and desperation had ended in miscarriage just weeks after Marcus's disappearance, a loss she'd grieved privately while dealing with the additional trauma of his vanishing. Learning that Marcus might have been planning to force her into an abortion added another layer of violation to her experience, but it also provided closure to questions she'd carried since adolescence. The Marcus Webb case became a textbook example of how modern forensic science could solve decades-old crimes, but it also highlighted the human cost of secrets and lies. Adam's 30-year silence had prevented the investigation from identifying Peterson as a suspect when physical evidence was fresh and witnesses' memories were clear. While his loyalty to Marcus was understandable, the consequences of that misplaced loyalty had allowed a killer to remain free for decades. Detective Sarah Chen used the case in training seminars for other cold case investigators, emphasizing the importance of re-examining witness statements and looking for information that might have been withheld due to loyalty, fear, or misguided protection of others involved. She also highlighted how changes in social attitudes and legal protections could make witnesses more willing to reveal information years after the original crime. The Webb case officially closed in 2019, but its effects continued to ripple through Riverside and the lives of everyone involved. The high school renamed its American History Award, previously called the Peterson Prize for Academic Excellence, and implemented new background check procedures for all staff members. The community struggled with questions about how many warning signs they might have missed, and whether other trusted figures might be hiding similar secrets. Adam Richardson returned to his engineering career with a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since high school. His marriage survived the revelation of his 30-year secret, strengthened by his wife's understanding that he'd been carrying an impossible burden since adolescence. He began speaking at high schools about the importance of reporting concerns about adult behavior, regardless of social pressures or loyalty conflict. The old quarry, where Marcus and Adam had their final conversation, was eventually filled in and converted to a community park. A small memorial marker commemorates Marcus Webb and acknowledges the tragedy that touched so many lives. But it also serves as a reminder that secrets kept in the name of loyalty can sometimes protect the very people who should be exposed. As Adam Richardson stood at his kitchen window on that October evening in 2023, watching the rain wash away the broken pieces of his coffee mug, he reflected on how a single moment of truth had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of everyone connected to Marcus Webb's disappearance. The yearbook that had triggered his confession lay open on the kitchen table, Marcus's 17-year-old face smiling up from a page that would never again hold the power to torment him. The phone call to Detective Chen had been the hardest thing Adam had ever done, but also the most necessary. 30 years of carrying Marcus's secret had taught him that some burdens are too heavy to bear alone, and some truths are too important to remain buried regardless of the pain they might cause. His confession had destroyed Thomas Peterson's carefully constructed facade and brought justice for a crime that had haunted a community for 3 decades. But the case had also revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of trust and the price of silence. How many other Thomas Petersons were hiding behind positions of authority and community respect? How many other students had paid the ultimate price for involvement with adults who should have protected them? These questions would continue to challenge Riverside long after the headlines faded and the media attention moved on to other stories. The Marcus Webb investigation had shown that justice, when it finally arrives, often brings as many questions as answers. Marcus's body was never recovered, leaving his family without the closure that comes from laying a loved one to rest. Thomas Peterson's death in prison had prevented a full accounting of his crimes and the possibility that other victims might be identified. The case was solved, but it was far from complete. Adam had learned that the teenage decision to protect a friend's secret had consequences that rippled across decades, affecting not just himself but everyone who had loved and mourned Marcus Webb. His silence had allowed a killer to remain free for 25 years, teaching other people's children while hiding the truth about his own capacity for violence. The weight of that realization would stay with Adam forever, a reminder that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do for a friend is to expose their darkest secrets to the light. The rain continued to fall outside Adam's window, washing the streets clean in the way that truth had finally cleansed his conscience. Tomorrow he would call the Webb family, as he did every year on the anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, to remember a friendship that had been complicated by tragedy but had ultimately led to justice. It wasn't the ending that any of them would have chosen, but it was the truth, and sometimes truth is the only peace that broken hearts can find. The yearbook would go back on the shelf, its power to trigger guilt finally broke. Marcus Webb would remain 17 forever in those pages, preserved in the amber of memory before drugs and desperation and adult corruption had stolen his future. But his story would continue to serve as a warning about the price of secrets and the courage required to speak truth in the face of consequences that seemed too terrible to bear. In the end, Adam Richardson had learned that loyalty without truth is just another form of betrayal, and that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing. The 30 years between Marcus's disappearance and Thomas Peterson's conviction had been marked by pain and uncertainty, but they had also demonstrated the power of persistence, the importance of hope, and the eventual triumph of truth over even the most carefully constructed lies. The coffee mug could be replaced, the broken trust could be rebuilt. The secrets that had poisoned a community for 30 years had finally been exposed to the disinfecting light of truth. And somewhere in a prison cell, Thomas Peterson had faced the consequences of choices made in desperation 30 years earlier, proving that time may heal some wounds, but it never erases the debt that justice demands. Marcus Webb's story was finally complete, not with the happy ending that everyone had hoped for, but with the truth that everyone deserved. And sometimes, Adam had learned, truth is the only gift we can give to the dead. The promise that their stories will not be forgotten, their lives will not be dismissed, and their killers will not escape the reckoning that justice eventually delivers to all who believe they can murder with impunity. The rain washed the last fragments of ceramic down the storm drain, carrying away the physical remnants of the moment when the past had finally caught up with the present. But the memory of Marcus Webb, and the lessons learned from his tragic disappearance, would endure long after the storm had passed and the streets had dried. Some stories, Adam knew now, are too important to remain untold, regardless of how much pain the telling might cause. Detective Sarah Chen's final report on the Marcus Webb case would eventually span 84 pages, documenting not just the investigation that led to Thomas Peterson's conviction, but the broader implications of a crime that had remained hidden for 3 decades. The report became required reading at police academies across Illinois, a case study in how modern forensic techniques could unlock secrets that traditional investigative methods had failed to expose. But Chen knew that the real lessons of the Webb case couldn't be captured in official reports or training manuals. The detective had seen how a single lie, told by a frightened teenager trying to protect a friend, had allowed a killer to remain free for 25 years. She'd witnessed how a community's trust in authority figures could blind them to predatory behavior hiding in plain sight. Most importantly, she'd learned that the passage of time didn't diminish the hunger for truth. It only made the eventual revelation more devastating to those who'd lived with uncertainty. Chen's career had been built on cold cases, on breathing life into investigations that others had abandoned to the filing cabinets of unsolved mysteries. The Webb case represented everything she'd learned about the persistence required to seek justice for victims whose voices had been silenced by violence and time. It also demonstrated how advances in forensic science could reach across decades to hold killers accountable for crimes they believed were safely buried in the past. In the months following Peterson's conviction, Chen received dozens of calls from other law enforcement agencies asking for guidance on similar cases. A high school teacher in Ohio was arrested for the 1987 disappearance of a student after DNA evidence linked him to the crime. A coach in Michigan was charged with murder after genetic genealogy identified him as the killer in a 20-year-old case. Each success vindicated Chen's belief that no crime was too old to solve if investigators were willing to apply modern techniques to ancient evidence. But the Webb case had also taught Chen about the human cost of delayed justice. She'd watched Adam Richardson struggle with 30 years of misplaced guilt, seen Jennifer Morrison Walsh grapple with trauma that had shaped her entire adult life, witnessed a community's faith in trusted institutions crumble under the weight of betrayal. Justice achieved after decades of waiting was still justice, but it came at a price that couldn't be calculated in courtroom victories or closed case files. The psychological profile that forensic psychiatrists developed for Thomas Peterson revealed a man who'd lived multiple lives with disturbing ease. To his students and colleagues, he'd been a dedicated educator who brought history to life through passionate teaching. To his gambling associates, he'd been a desperate addict willing to risk everything for the next bet. To his drug customers, he'd been a reliable supplier who used his position to facilitate transactions that should never have involved teenagers. To Marcus Webb, he'd ultimately been death itself, disguised as a mentor and authority figure. Peterson's case files revealed evidence of manipulation and grooming that extended far beyond his relationship with Mark. Other students came forward after his arrest, describing uncomfortable interactions, inappropriate questions about their personal lives, and pressure to participate in activities that had seemed questionable even to teenage minds conditioned to respect adult authority. The full scope of Peterson's exploitation might never be known, but it was clear that Marcus hadn't been his first victim, just his most tragic one. The impact on Riverside High School extended far beyond the immediate shock of Peterson's arrest. The administration implemented comprehensive background checks for all employees, established anonymous reporting systems for students to report inappropriate behavior, and created educational programs about recognizing and reporting predatory conduct. The Peterson Prize for Academic Excellence was permanently retired, its tainted legacy replaced by scholarship funds dedicated to Marcus Webb's memory. Adam Richardson's testimony during Peterson's trial had been devastating in its quiet precision. Standing before a packed courtroom, he described the teenage Marcus with an honesty that revealed both his friend's promise and his flaws. Marcus hadn't been a perfect victim. His involvement with drugs and his callous treatment of Jennifer Morrison's pregnancy had contributed to the circumstances that led to his death. But Peterson's manipulation and ultimate violence had robbed Marcus of the chance to learn from his mistakes, to grow beyond the poor decisions that marked his final week. The courtroom had been silent as Adam described their last conversation at the quarry, Marcus's desperation palpable even 30 years later. When Peterson's defense attorney suggested that Adam's delayed revelation made him unreliable, Adam's response had been simple and devastating. I was 18 years old, scared and trying to protect my friend's reputation. I made a terrible mistake that I've regretted every day. But my mistake doesn't change what Thomas Peterson did to Marcus, and it doesn't excuse 30 years of letting a killer teach other people's children. Jennifer Morrison Walsh's testimony had been equally powerful. her description of Marcus's reaction to her pregnancy revealing the toxic masculinity and entitlement that had characterized his final days. She'd spoken with the clarity of someone who'd spent decades processing trauma, explaining how a 15-year-old girl had been caught between an unplanned pregnancy, a frightened boyfriend, and adult authority figures who'd failed to protect her from exploitation. The sentencing phase had brought the Webb family face-to-face with Peterson for the first time since Marcus's disappearance. Marcus's father, now in his 70s, had stared at the man who'd killed his son and spoken with quiet dignity about 30 years of wondering, hoping and grieving. His victim impact statement had focused not on revenge, but on the countless nights he'd stayed awake wondering if Marcus was alive somewhere, unable to make peace with loss because the truth had remained hidden. Marcus's mother had died in 2009, never knowing what had happened to her son. The family's statement noted that she'd spent her final years visiting psychics and following false leads, never able to accept that Marcus was gone because his killer had constructed such an effective deception. Peterson's crimes had stolen not just Marcus's life, but his family's ability to grieve properly, leaving them suspended in uncertainty that had lasted until long after normal mourning should have concluded. The media coverage of Peterson's conviction sparked national discussions about predatory behavior in educational settings, and the long-term impact of unsolved crimes on community. Crime documentary producers approached the Webb family about telling Marcus's story, but they declined all offers, preferring to keep his memory private rather than turning his tragedy into entertainment. The family established a foundation focused on improving missing person investigations and supporting families dealing with unresolved cases. Detective Chen retired from the Illinois State Police in 2022. Her career bookended by cold cases that had demonstrated both the potential and limitations of forensic science. The Webb case remained her most significant professional achievement, but she'd learned that solving mysteries didn't always provide the closure that victims' families expected. Truth could be painful, justice could be incomplete, and the passage of time could never fully heal wounds inflicted by violent crime.